Today's video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN, of whom more in a bit. Hello ladies and gentlemen. Today we're looking at Crossharbour. Crossharbour is a station in London's Docklands on the Lewisham branch of the Docklands Light Railway. It's not far from Canary Wharf. I'm gonna take one of those bold stances and argue that it's the most DLR-y station on the DLR. A stance which I will explain later. For now, let's talk about the fact that Crossharbour is actually not the first station to exist here. That first station is a long-gone station named Millwall Docks. It all begins in 1840 with the opening of the London and Blackwall Railway. This was kind of unusual as railways go. Most early railways were designed to carry goods and ended up carrying passengers. The London and Blackwall Railway did it the other way around. Its trains were passenger coaches hauled by rope along a track that was built to a gauge of 5 feet, about 4 inches wider than standard, to accommodate the rope. But as the docks and the rail network grew, the Blackwall line became isolated, which was ridiculous because a line from the Docklands into the heart of the city should have been a gold mine. In 1849 the line was converted to standard gauge, and steam locomotive haulage was brought in. This allowed the railway to expand, and they set eyes upon the Isle of Dogs. For centuries the Isle of Dogs had been nothing but marshland, no good for anything. In fact, one theory as to how it got its name was that it was corrupted from Isle of Ducks. But the 19th century saw the docks of London expand massively. The West India Docks were built in the early 19th century, and suddenly the Isle of Dogs was worth something. Industries began to spring up. Another dock was approved, the Millwall dock. The London and Blackwall Railway decided that it was time to cash in before land got too expensive to make it worthwhile. They proposed a line across the island. But the docks, the very thing that made the line attractive, would prove to be a sticking point. The issue was this. The docks were owned by different companies. The East and West India Dock Company weren't at all happy with the Millwall Dock Company muscling in on their turf. The railway was caught in the crossfire. The West India docks were built before railways were widespread and so couldn't take full advantage of them. The Millwall dock was built with rail haulage in mind from the start, complete with an internal railway network. The East and West India Dock Company certainly weren't going to help them to get a mainline connection, and, fortunately for them, they owned the land that the London and Blackwall would have to cross. The original proposal would have involved a tunnel under the docks. The dock company objected. The railway company went back to the drawing board and returned with a different proposal. A new station known as Millwall Junction, roughly where Poplar DLR is today. A branch off there running to the east of the docks. Connections to both the West India Docks and the Millwall Docks. 3 stations: South Dock, Millwall Docks, and finally North Greenwich, next to the current site of Island Gardens. Parliament gave their approval in 1865, but then another problem arose. This time it wasn't the dock company's fault. The London and Blackwall Railway was leased to the Great Eastern Railway, which put everything on hold. While they're sorting all that out, back in 1865, I think it's a good time to tell you about Surfshark VPN, the sponsor of today's video. See, I was on Reddit recently and reading about people complaining that since the Online Safety Act came into force, they couldn't access salacious content about such lascivious topics as home brewing, weight loss, and spiders. Turns out there's a lot of stuff that's considered adult content. That being said, I haven't experienced any of this myself because I have Surfshark VPN. Wait, does that logo appear every time I say those words? Surfshark VPN. Well anyway, with its advanced encryption and servers in over 100 countries, you can look at as many spiders as you like, with no fear of censorship or your data being harvested by some dodgy age verification service. Those international servers also mean that you can get extra value from your streaming services by accessing other countries' spider-related programs or indeed anything else they have. If you're looking to buy spider accessories or whatever else, you can get access to region-specific pricing and save money. Another great thing about Surfshark is that it can be used on all platforms and unlimited devices. All your spiders could have a device in each hand and they'd still be able to use Surfshark. For viewers of this channel, there's a special offer available. Check out the link in the description below, that is surfshark.com/Jago, and enter the code JAGO to get 4 months extra free. So now it's not just spiders who can safely use the web. Now, where was I? The Millwall docks were opened in 1868. They were designed by John Fowler, who coincidentally had been the engineer behind the Metropolitan line of the London Underground. Nothing to do with the Millwall line. I just thought it was interesting. The deal was that responsibility for the line would be divided between 3 companies. The Millwall docks, where it ran across their land, the West India docks, where it ran across their land, and the Great Eastern Railway for the rest of it. This slowed things down even more because the dock companies seemingly weren't in a hurry to get their sections of the line built. The West India dock section wasn't built until 1870, but the company only built one of the 2 tracks they'd agreed to. The Millwall Dock Company built 2 tracks, but didn't finish them until 1871. The bit to North Greenwich wasn't opened until 1872. The whole line would be known as the Millwall Extension Railway. Millwall Dock Station was a very simple thing. It was, as you might expect, part of the Millwall Docks section, consisting of a single timber platform and a basic building. The reason there was only one platform for 2 tracks was because only one track was for passengers, the other was for goods trains. Oddly enough, despite being such a basic station, it did have a tea room that was pretty popular locally. The writer J.E. Connor speculates that this is why Millwall Docks Station was the only station on the line that issued platform tickets for people who didn't want to travel. It wasn't smooth sailing for the Millwall Extension Railway. For one thing, the line was laid very lightly, which severely limited the kinds of locomotive that could be used. The company had a small selection of tiny second-hand locomotives just for this line. Even then, the India Dock boys were being difficult. The buildings around here were timber, and they had a wool warehouse near the line, so they forbade steam locomotives from crossing their property. Or rather, their insurers did, for fear of an errant spark causing disaster. So what happened was that steam trains would run from Millwall Junction to the West India Dock boundary, then passengers would have to get into a horse tram. Then at the Millwall Dock boundary they'd have to change again onto another steam train to North Greenwich. It hardly seemed worth it for a railway that was only 1.5 miles long. Everyone complained. Eventually the East and West India Docks Company grumpily agreed to double their track and allow steam trains over the whole line. Services began in 1880. The Millwall Company seemingly drew the short straw and had to order the locomotives. These were 3 adorable little tank engines built by Manning Wardle, reputedly the smallest standard-gauge passenger engines in Britain at the time. They had to be tiny in order to pass over the weak bridges. Typical trains were 3 coaches long, rising to 5 from 1885 when Millwall FC were playing at home. This was a bit much for the little engines, but it was an important source of revenue for the line. Or, as the fans might have put it, the engines don't like us, but the company doesn't care. In fact, probably because of this traffic, the station was rebuilt in 1888, and in 1892 the platform was extended. The cutthroat competition between the docks got so bad that the docks as a whole were at risk. The companies would overextend themselves to the point of bankruptcy. But every one of them was essential to the functioning of London. So the Port of London Authority was formed in 1909 to take the lot over. This included the railways that served the docks and, thanks to the fact that most of the Millwall Extension Railway was on dock land, they got that as well. But in 1910, Millwall FC relocated to southeast London, and that had a nasty impact on passenger traffic. So too did the arrival of buses. By 1920, the little engines were worn out beyond repair. The PLA tried replacing them with steam rail motors, similar but not identical to this one, but they were too long and too heavy. The London and North Eastern Railway, who had taken the Great Eastern Railway over in 1923, decided to call it a day on running passenger trains over the London and Blackwall, and the PLA decided to follow suit on the Millwall line. The general strike of 1926 provided a convenient point to bring things to a close. On the 4th of May 1926, services ceased forever at Millwall Dock Station. As it wasn't much of a station to begin with, demolition in 1930 left no trace behind other than the remains of the embankment the line was built on. The line might have closed, but the PLA still operated railways around here. In fact, they had a shed at Millwall for their extensive fleet of small four-wheeled engines. The story of the PLA railways is a long and complex one, so I'm afraid I can't go into too much detail here. I just mention it for the sake of completeness. Well, the docks were an enormously important source of traffic for the railways, right up until they weren't. In the 1960s and 70s, cargo began to be handled downriver at Tilbury. Even the largest of the London docks couldn't handle the big container ships. Millwall docks were no exception to this. The PLA railway here closed in 1970, and the dock itself went in 1981. The docks had been the nucleus of the community around here. They provided employment for thousands of people, with thousands more working in the industries that served them. Something dramatic would have to be done to regenerate the area. The London Docklands Development Corporation was set up to cut through the red tape and rebuild. Initially, the transport link that had been envisioned was a tube line. The area would eventually get that in the form of the Jubilee Line extension, but not until 1999. Back in the 70s and 80s, the government didn't imagine that the docks could ever justify the cost of a tube line. Other ideas were considered, express buses or perhaps even a tramway. But a new concept in urban transit was coming to the fore: light rail. This was incredibly modern, yet at the same time incredibly cheap. The advantage was, as its name states, that it was light. You could lay the track over existing, older infrastructure. There was plenty of that. A London and Blackwall railway viaduct from Fenchurch Street to the West India Docks, and a Millwall extension railway viaduct from Mudchute to Island Gardens. There was some opposition from those in power because while light rail was cheap, it wasn't as cheap as buses. But the counter-argument was that the service a rail link could offer would stimulate economic growth. The railway could generate its own traffic. And so approval was granted in 1982. And here I should explain what I meant by Crossharbour being the DLRist DLR station. Back then, the concept of a development on the scale of Canary Wharf simply hadn't occurred to anyone. A massive Manhattan-style commercial development miles from the city? Madness. It'll never work. Get out of here. No, what the Development Corporation imagined was low-rise blocks of flats, light industry and light commercial development. Exactly the sort of thing we see around Crossharbour Station, in fact. Of course, Canary Wharf would turn everything upside down, completely reshaping the way people looked at the Docklands. The DLR line through Crossharbour more or less followed the route of the old Millwall extension railway. After all, with the basically solid Millwall viaduct and the remains of the embankment still in place, it was the easiest option. In the early stages of development, the station was to be called Glengall Grove after a nearby street. Why it was changed, I don't know. Perhaps they thought Crossharbour sounded cooler and more dynamic. According to Hidden London, it comes from Glengall Bridge, but since their website seems to be down, I can't determine their reasoning for this. The station opened on the 31st of August 1987. The line only went as far as Island Gardens back then. The DLR network only consisted of lines to Island Gardens, Stratford and Tower Gateway, with Poplar as a hub. Crossharbour Station looked a little different then. The 90s would see a few changes. Probably the most obvious one, at least if you weren't a regular user, was in 1994 when the station name was changed to Crossharbour for London Arena. The Arena was an events and sporting venue that opened in 1989. This worked out quite well for the DLR since they had the closest rail connection to the Arena. Echoes of the Millwall Extension Railway serving Millwall FC there. Unfortunately, the DLR wasn't really designed to handle that volume of traffic. Fans just couldn't rely on it to get there. The inadequate transport links were a major factor in the venue struggling to stay afloat. In fact, it first went into receivership in 1991. In 2003 the venue was sold. It struggled to find occupants, and in 2005 it closed for good. It was demolished in 2006, and possibly with a shrug of the shoulders, the DLR changed Crossharbour for London Arena back to plain old Crossharbour. But this time the loss of a sporting venue wouldn't be such a problem for the railway. By now Canary Wharf was well established, and the Isle of Dogs was an important business centre. The DLR extended from Island Gardens under the river to Lewisham in 1999, and that brought upgrades to the stations along the route. The old canopies at Crossharbour were replaced with a big overall roof that's still there. The modern Crossharbour couldn't be much more different from the old Millwall docks. It's a busy commuter station. I'd describe it as being in a sort of border country between the old Isle of Dogs and the new. But though it's a very different station these days, it's still running around an old and awkward alignment, still using small trains, still beholden to what's happening around the docks. Almost poetic, I suppose. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Today's main sources, and there's quite a lot of them, were The Forgotten Stations of Greater London by J. E. Connor and B. L. Halford, The Blackwall and Millwall Extension Railways by Geoffrey Body, London's Dock Railways Part 1 by Dave Marden, The DLR Handbook by Stephen Jolly and Bob Bayman, The Railways of London Docklands by Jonathan Willis, and Dockland by North East London Polytechnic in the GLC. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the tiny engine to my 3 coaches. I'd also like to thank Surfshark VPN for sponsoring today's video. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.